The cell is barely wider than a coffin. Stone walls weep with damp, the air thick with the stench of mold and something older, something that rots but never dies. A single candle fights to stay alive in the stale darkness, its flame trembling as if it knows what's coming. On the floor, shackled hands twitch. The prisoner is barefoot, knees drawn up, trembling, not from the cold but from the quiet, because the quiet is never empty. Somewhere beneath the floor, a restless scratching stirs, a whisper of claws on stone. It grows louder, closer. They have been starved for days, not the prisoner, but the creatures. Two guards enter. They do not speak. They do not need to. Between them a clay pot. Inside, the shifting weight of life. One guard kneels, pressing the pot's open mouth against the prisoner's bare abdomen. The other brings the iron bar, heated until it glows a dull, angry red. When the metal touches the pot, the scratching turns frantic. There is only one way out for the rats now, forward, into flesh. It is not the speed of death that terrifies here, but its slowness, the inevitability, the knowledge that once it begins, there is nothing to stop it, because the thing eating you alive is not bound by mercy. This is not folklore, not a fever dream. This was Europe, medieval justice, dressed in the silence of stone corridors and the screams no one bothered to count. Today we strip away the legend and face the truth. The air in the cell clung to the skin like damp cloth, pressing into every breath. The stone walls sweated in the dark, their cold moisture running in slow, patient streams toward the floor, where it pooled into shallow depressions worn by centuries of bodies. The air was heavy with the rot of straw that had once been bedding, but now lay flattened into a sour mat of mold, alive with lice and the faint crawl of unseen legs. No light came from the outside world. The only illumination was a sickly spill of grey, seeping from a slit too narrow for a hand, too high for eyes to reach. Even in daylight, it barely touched the floor. By night, it disappeared entirely, and the darkness became absolute, a darkness in which one could no longer tell if the eyes were open or closed. The prisoner had learned, in these long hours without measure, that silence is not empty. It has a shape, a weight. It presses against the mind until thoughts lose their edges, until even memory begins to erode. And then, within that silence, small sounds gain monstrous size. The clink of a guard's boot far above, the shudder of a bolt drawn back, the faintest scratching behind the walls. The scratching came often. At first, it had been a curiosity, a question in the blackness. But in time, it became something else, a reminder that this place was not only for the living. The dungeons beneath the city were a layered grave, men above, rats below, feeding and breeding in the unseen tunnels cut through centuries of refuse. Here, justice was not a trial or a spectacle. It was a slow, silent erosion, a ritual of deprivation. The lucky ones bled quickly in the public square, their death absorbed into the noise of the crowd. The unlucky were left here, in the company of walls and whispers, to be hollowed out 1 hour at a time. The gaolers did not shout or curse. They did not need to. They moved with the indifference of men carrying buckets of water, ladles of thin gruel, or the tools of something worse. Torture here was not a burst of violence. It was as natural as the changing of the guard, as regular as the turning of keys. Pain was simply part of the air one breathed. And yet, beneath the weight of that air, the mind still clung to itself. Faces came and went behind closed eyes, a mother's hands, a child's laugh, the smell of warm bread. They would not stay. The silence took them, stripping away not only comfort, but the sense that one had ever been anything but a prisoner. Somewhere, faintly, the scratching began again. This time it was closer, a restless, hungry rhythm that set the hairs on the prisoner's arms on edge. The rats did not fear the living. They knew the boundaries here. They came when they wished. They took what was offered. Far above, the sound of boots on stone drew nearer. The lock groaned in its socket. The door did not open yet, but the scratching in the walls seemed to grow bolder, as though it knew. In the dark, the prisoner's breath slowed. It was not a prayer. There was no God here, only stone and iron, and the things that thrived between them. And when the key finally turned, the silence seemed to lean in, listening. It began in the corners, always the corners, where the shadows pooled and the straw rotted, where the scraps of bread fell from careless hands and the bones were tossed without thought. In the medieval night, when the hearth fires dimmed and the streets emptied, they moved like spilled ink, the black rat, Rattus rattus, and its heavier cousin, Rattus norvegicus, whose blunt muzzle and watchful eyes marked it as something older, colder. They did not need much to survive. A mouthful of grain, a strip of tendon, the marrow sucked from a discarded joint. They bred in walls, in rafters, in the black rivers that ran beneath cities like London, Ghent and Bruges. They were not visitors in the human world. They were its shadow, its unacknowledged twin. Hunger shaped them into perfect opportunists. Starve them for a day and they became restless. Starve them for 3 and they became something else entirely. Their teeth, hard as iron and sharper than the knife of a careless gaoler, never stopped growing. They could chew through wood, bone, leather and flesh with the same cold precision. They did not kill from malice. That is the horror. A man might decide to spare you. A rat never would. When the scent of blood reached them, when heat and movement signaled life beneath their paws, there was no hesitation, only the blind arithmetic of survival. The torturers knew this. They knew how to drive an animal beyond the edge of fear, to where hunger burned hotter than any fire. They knew that a rat, trapped between an unbearable heat and the softness of living flesh, would choose the only path it had left. They knew, and they turned that knowledge into a tool. It was not an invention in the way a blade is forged or a gallows built. It was an adoption, a theft from nature's ledger. The rat had always eaten. The torturer simply removed the choice of what to eat first. The victim's body became geography, a terrain the animal must cross to escape, its skin no more sacred than the wood of a door or the weave of a sack. And there was something almost elegant, in a way only cruelty can be elegant, about the absence of the torturer's own hand in the act. No knife, no club, no rope, only the creature and its appetite, the gaoler merely the stagehand who set the scene. When the screaming began, it was the rat's doing, yet the rat bore no guilt. The human who arranged the meeting remained untouched, a figure in the shadows. The prisoners understood this instinctively. To be beaten was one thing. It kept the hatred clean. But to be eaten alive by something that neither knew nor cared for the meaning of your pain, that was a deeper kind of violation. There was no one to bargain with, no language to reach across. You were simply a warm, edible obstacle. In the marketplaces, rats were cursed for spreading plague, for fouling grain, for biting infants in their cradles. But here, in the stone belly of the prison, their role was different. They were executioners without conscience, partners in a pact they could not understand. On feast days above, men drank and sang in the taverns, unaware or unwilling to know that beneath their feet a different kind of banquet was being prepared. In the dark, the animals waited, their whiskers quivering at the scent of sweat, their claws scratching softly against the clay that would soon be pressed to human skin. There was no morality in their hunger, no guilt in their escape. They would emerge slick with blood, their bellies swollen, their eyes catching the candlelight for just a moment before they vanished again into the labyrinth. The gaoler would lift the pot and the work would be done. And somewhere in the silence afterward, a rat would pause, clean its paws, and wait for the next time man's cruelty and nature's appetite found each other again. The room was not large. It did not need to be. The stone held the heat and the smell and the sound. The prisoner was already shackled, wrists drawn behind the back, ankles clamped in iron. The body bent forward in an unnatural posture, spine exposed, belly drawn taut, a shape made not for comfort, but for helplessness. Breath came quick, shallow, the chest rising against the cold bite of metal. The gaoler moved without haste. Torture did not belong to anger here. Anger was messy. This was ritual. An act rehearsed 100 times, each step performed with the stillness of someone tying a familiar knot. A clay pot sat on the table. Its rim was blackened with old soot, its body chipped from years of handling. Inside, the soft scrape of claws, 2 pairs, 3. The smell was faint at first. Warm fur, stale urine, the musk of a thing that lives in darkness. The prisoner tensed at the sound, but the shackles held, forcing stillness. The pot was placed upside down on the bare stomach, the rim pressing into skin. The gaoler's hand slid beneath, checking the seal. The belly quivered, not from cold now, but from the tremor of anticipation that tightens every muscle before pain. A second man brought the iron. It had been resting in the brazier, its tip buried in glowing embers until it glowed a deep, sullen red. The heat shimmered in the air between them. The iron did not touch the flesh, it touched the pot. The first sound from inside was not loud, just a sudden, frantic scurry. Then the scratching began, sharp and insistent, claws raking the clay from within. The heat spread through the vessel, slow at first, then faster, until the air inside became a furnace. The rats moved in wild circles, searching for escape. There was only one way out. When they found the belly, they hesitated only a moment. The flesh was warm, the smell of sweat and blood just beneath the skin. Their teeth, 6 times sharper than a dog's, pierced easily. The first bite drew a sound from the prisoner that was not yet a scream, but a stifled, wounded gasp, as if disbelief had taken the breath before pain could claim it. The gaoler watched without expression. This was the design. Not a killing blow, not an immediate ruin of the body, but a slow opening. The rats would burrow to where the heat could not reach them, gnawing through muscle, tunneling toward the cooler, wetter depths within. It was said that a skilled torturer could keep a victim alive for hours this way. Not whole hours of screaming, but waves of it, each bite, each tearing of sinew, sending the body into shock, then dragging it back again when the next movement began. In Antwerp, during the Dutch Revolt, prisoners were broken this way for confessions they had already given. In Lima, under the Spanish colonial governors, rebels and thieves alike felt the scrape of claws inside them before the end. There were no tools finer than those fashioned by hunger. The mind broke differently from the body. Some fought against the straps until they collapsed in exhaustion, the muscles burning even as their insides were eaten. Others went still, their eyes fixed on something invisible, retreating inward as if to flee before the flesh could be emptied. But there was no escape. The pot grew hotter, the rats dug deeper, the belly swelled with blood that would never see the air again. And through it all, the gaoler's hand would rest lightly on the vessel, feeling the faint vibrations of movement beneath, the last measure of life left in the one below. When it ended, it did not end with a clean death. Sometimes the prisoner lived long enough to feel the pot lifted, to see the slick bodies vanish back into the darkness from which they came, their work finished. Sometimes the wounds were fatal in minutes, other times the fever took days to claim what the rats had begun. Either way, the silence that followed was not peace. It was an echo, the knowledge that nothing in the act had been personal. It had been necessity, precision, patience, a meeting between heat, hunger, and flesh. And in that echo, in the cold after the fire, lay the true horror that a man could stand in the same room, untouched, and let another living thing do all the work of unmaking a human being. The gallows stood where the market square widened, a black shape against the pale sky. The wood was weathered, its grain darkened by rain and the slow seep of what had fallen from the bodies it bore. People came when the bell rang, not out of bloodlust alone, but because absence was noticed. To ignore the summons was to draw eyes, and eyes in such times could be dangerous. Here, punishment was not a private matter. A severed hand laid upon the city gates told the thief's fate without words. The iron cage hanging above the bridge, its occupant long reduced to bone and cloth scraps, spoke louder than any decree. The king's justice was a theater where the stage was the street and the audience was everyone. But not all performances required a crowd. Some were staged in shadow, the only witnesses stone walls and the men who carried the keys. These were punishments designed not for spectacle, but for rumor, for whispers that traveled further than a herald's voice, slipping under doors and across tavern benches, carrying images far more terrible than anything the daylight could show. Rat torture belonged to that hidden theater. It was not meant to rally the crowd in outrage or loyalty. It was meant to settle into the mind like a splinter, A man might vanish from the barracks one night and be seen weeks later, pale and hollow-eyed, walking strangely, unable to speak of what had happened. He did not need to. The silence told enough. In the courts of Philip II, in the dungeons of Antwerp, the sentence might not be written in the open record. It was discretion that made it powerful, the idea that punishment could arrive unseen, without a scaffold, without the drums of procession. The knowledge that the crown could reach not only your body, but the very boundaries of your mind, leaving you to live in the echo of what had been done. The authorities understood the currency of fear. Public executions taught the body what would happen if it defied the law. Hidden tortures taught the mind that there were places worse than death, places where the suffering was not over when the guards left the room. In such a landscape, obedience was not loyalty, it was self-preservation, drilled into the marrow. The peasants told stories over winter fires, half believed, half feared, of men who had been given to the rats, of soldiers who had confessed to crimes they could not name, of wives who disappeared into the castle keep and were never spoken of again. Some said they had heard the scratching in the walls of the old prison, even when it had been empty for years. Such tales had no need for proof. In fact, they thrived without it. A public hanging required a scaffold, a rope, a body. This required only the listener's imagination, and imagination is a crueler executioner than any man. The gaolers themselves were instruments in this theatre. They did not boast of their work. They let the silence carry the weight. A look, a passing mention, the way a hand lingered on a key. These were enough to feed the stories that would keep a town in line. The victim's suffering was not for the immediate gratification of a mob. It was an investment in order, a seed of dread sown across the land. Above, life continued. The markets bustled. Coins clinked in the hands of merchants. Children chased each other through alleys, slick with rain. But beneath, in chambers without light, the play continued in its own way. There, no crowd was needed, because the audience was the future. Those who might think to resist would remember the whispers, the scratching, the heat of a pot against bare skin, and they would stop before their first step. And so the rats, the iron, the clay, were not simply tools of cruelty. They were letters in the unspoken script of power, written into the hearts of those who never saw them, yet knew their meaning all the same. Some punishments end when the body dies. This one lingered, not only in those who endured it, but in those who feared they might. It begins on the surface, always on the surface. A puncture, no wider than the width of a thumb, ringed in red, warm to the touch. It is the smallest wound a man might imagine in such a moment. But size means nothing to teeth that never stop growing. The rats bite clean with a snap of the jaw and a twist of the head, leaving edges that do not clot quickly. Beneath the skin, the damage spreads faster than the mind can comprehend. The first layer, soft muscle, is torn in strands, each fiber separating like rope, unraveling under strain. Blood pools in the cavity, dark and sluggish, carrying with it the airless stink of torn flesh. The rats do not linger at the wound. Their bodies move forward, guided by warmth, by the smell of life. They burrow, scraping through layers of tissue that ripple under their claws. The belly, once a wall, becomes a path. Every movement draws a reaction. The body arches. Tendons pull tight. The skin trembles around the intrusion. The mind, in its first desperate moments, still believes in escape. That belief dies long before the body does. Infection begins almost immediately. These are not creatures of clean soil or pure water. Their mouths carry the filth of the alleyway, the plague pit, the midden heap. Bacteria flood the wound, clinging to shredded flesh, multiplying in the wet heat of the cavity. By the first day, the skin swells, darkens. By the second, the stench is no longer the rats, it is the body itself, rotting from within. Septicemia takes hold silently, creeping into the blood like a shadow spreading across water. The victim feels it as heat in the veins, as a deep ache in the joints, as a sickness that no breath can shake. Shivers come even in the heat of the cell, the teeth chattering though the body burns. The mind dulls, thoughts move slowly, as if through thick mud. And yet, death is rarely swift. The wound festers, the belly distends, the skin splits in thin, weeping lines. Pus seeps into the straw, staining it yellow, then brown, then black. Flies gather if the dungeon allows light enough to guide them. Where there is no light, only the rats return, drawn again to what they began. In some, the body fights white blood cells surging to stem the invasion. But the victory is hollow. The tissue remains ragged, the scar a raised, ugly ridge across the abdomen. And under it, nerves have been severed, muscle torn in ways that will never mend. These survivors walk differently, they breathe differently. They carry their organs like glass vessels, aware that any sudden movement could reopen what time has only sealed at the surface. The battlefield is not only the flesh. Inside, the body becomes enemy to itself. The immune system, overrun, begins to destroy healthy cells in its blind fury. The fever drives hallucinations, faces at the edge of vision, voices in the scratching of the walls. In that haze, the victim may relive the moment again and again, unable to tell whether the rats are gone or waiting just beyond the edge of the blanket. Medieval healers could do little beyond packing the wound with moss, honey, or linen soaked in wine. These might slow the rot, but could not undo the tearing. No surgeon's needle could repair the damage left by teeth that carved their own passage. And so the body remains a record of the siege it endured. In death, the ribs may still bear faint grooves where claws scraped bone. In life, the survivor carries the memory as a constant ache, a ghost wound that pulses with the weather, a reminder written not in ink but in the language of torn tissue. A man can lose a hand and still work, lose an eye and still see, but to have the center of the body breached, to have the fortress walls torn down from within, is to know that the self can be invaded and nothing will ever feel safe again. And in that knowledge lies the true cruelty. The rats leave when they are done. The body, however, never stops being the place where they once were. There are no diaries from the ones who endured it, no trembling signatures on parchment, no last words scratched into the wood of the cell. Whatever was said in those moments either never left the prisoner's throat or was swallowed by the stone itself. The walls remember better than men do. They have heard the choked gasps, the thin, high sounds of disbelief when the first bite came, the sobbing that followed when the body understood there was no help coming. These noises do not echo like shouts. They sink, absorbed into the damp as if the stone is feeding too. The gaolers were not chroniclers. Their notes, if any were taken, spoke in cold terms. A name, a date, a single word, examinatis, interrogated. What happened between the placing of the pot and the end was not something they recorded. Words could not match the reality, and perhaps they feared they would not be believed, or perhaps they feared they would. Witnesses on the outside never saw the act. They saw the aftermath. A man returned to his cellmates unable to stand fully upright, moving with a stiff, guarded gait, eyes vacant as if fixed on some point too distant to reach. A woman who covered her abdomen when she slept, who startled at the sound of rats in the dark, who refused food for days as if her body no longer belonged to her. Sometimes the victims lived long enough to be freed. Their families spoke of them in low voices as though too much light might cause them to crumble. There were changes that could not be hidden, a faint tremor in the hands, a pallor that clung like frost, the tendency to wake screaming in the small hours, clawing at the belly as though the skin were still being breached. And there were those who never returned. Their absence was itself a message. In towns and villages under the reach of the crown, people learned to fill those silences with their own imagining. That imagining was often worse than the truth, and in that way, the punishment outlived the punished. The church offered prayers for the souls of the dead, but none for those left alive with the memory. Confession could unburden a man of sin, but not of the sound of claws against clay or the wet heat inside one's own body as it was eaten. These things had no right of cleansing. The stone kept its whispers. Every prisoner who passed through those halls could feel them, not as sound, but as pressure, as a presence in the corners of the cell, as a knowing that the air itself had been breathed by the dying. The scratching in the walls might be real, might be nothing but memory, but either way it set the nerves alight. Those who survived learned quickly not to speak of it. Silence became the last shield, the only thing left that was still theirs to control. But silence can only protect the self. It cannot protect the next man taken from his cot at night, or the woman led away with her head bent low. So the stone went on keeping its counsel. The gaolers went on walking their rounds. The rats went on breeding in the dark. And somewhere in the city above, another voice was lowered at the mention of a name. Another rumor passed over wine. Another whispered story of a punishment that might come in the night, unseen, unheard, and all the more feared for it. Cruelty does not vanish when a king dies. It changes shape, changes hands, wears a new accent, but the work it does is the same. The rat and the pot survived the centuries not because they were remembered in lore, but because they were remembered in whispers. In the 17th century, during the Dutch Revolt, Spanish captains brought it out again in the low stone keeps along the Scheldt. Prisoners accused of sedition were not always marched to the square. Some were taken instead to the vaulted rooms below, where the fire and the clay waited. They emerged days later, if they emerged at all, marked in ways that no surgeon could mend. Soldiers spoke of comrades whose spirits broke before their bodies did. Men who begged to be shot rather than face the pot again. Across the ocean, the method sailed with the galleons. In the damp prisons of Lima and Cartagena, colonial governors found it useful for pirates, rebels, and anyone whose words threatened the order they built on stolen soil. There, the rats were larger, fatter from the markets and refuse of the ports, their bites heavier, their hunger swifter. The cell floors were warm with the heat of the tropics, making the pot's work even quicker, even more desperate. In the prisons of the Portuguese Inquisition, records speak obliquely of animal interrogation, a phrase that hid more than it revealed. The faithful heard it and imagined the rack, the whip, the branding iron. Few imagined the moment when the iron met clay and something small and living was given permission to escape. Even in the modern age, it did not die. In the back rooms of police barracks under military juntas, in the basements of certain intelligence buildings during civil wars, there are accounts too similar to dismiss as invention. Survivors from these later years speak carefully, their voices faltering when they reach the part where the heat begins, where the scratching grows wild. They have lived long enough to see their stories doubted, long enough to watch the old cruelty disguised as new. What remains constant is not the tool. The pot could be tin, the fire a lamp, but the principle that hunger, panic, and pain can be made to work together, each feeding the other until the human will collapses under the weight of its own body. The torturer need not be skilled, only patient. Empires rise on laws and armies, but they maintain themselves with fear, not the sudden fear of battle, but the slow, private fear of what might be done to you where no one can see. Rat torture thrived in those spaces because it left little to display but much to imagine. And imagination is an empire's most loyal servant. From the Low Countries to South America, from fortress to fortress, the same ritual played out: shackles, clay, heat, the frantic digging of claws. The same silence afterward, broken only by the scrape of the pot being set aside. The method belonged to no single crown or creed. It belonged to the darker inheritance that passes quietly between rulers, outliving their banners and their faiths. Centuries later, in the ruins of an old prison, a mason repairing a wall found bones too small to be human, their teeth still sharp in the brittle jaw. He threw them away without thinking, but the stone kept the memory, as stone always does. The empire that placed them there was gone, but its echo was still in the air, in the dust, in the damp, in the places where men still fear to be alone with the sound of scratching. It is easy to lay such things at the feet of the Middle Ages, to imagine them as a distant age of ignorance, where cruelty was inevitable. Easier still to believe that men have since outgrown the need for such tools. But the truth is older, and it is nearer. The pot, the fire, the rats, these were not born from superstition. They were not the mindless brutality of peasants in mud hovels, but deliberate acts chosen by men in robes and seals, soldiers in polished boots, governors whose handwriting was precise and whose commands were written on fine parchment. It was reason, not rage, that kept this method alive. To call it medieval is to lock it safely behind a wall of centuries, as though cruelty obeys the borders of time. But cruelty has no loyalty to dates or dynasties. It flows through them like water through cracks, taking the shape of the vessel it fills. When the gallows fell out of favor, the firing squad stood ready. When the rack was condemned, there were quieter rooms, smaller tools, subtler wounds. The myth of medieval darkness comforts the living. It lets them believe they stand on a higher shore, that the river has been crossed and cannot be crossed again. But the truth is that the river is wide, and the bank they stand on is made of the same earth as the one they condemn. In every century, there have been men who looked at another human body and saw not a person, but an opportunity to extract, to warn, to break. The tools differ, the setting changes, but the act itself remains familiar. Hunger, fear, and pain have no era. They are always here, waiting for someone to put them to use. The clay pot could just as easily be tin. The brazier could be replaced by an electric coil. The cell could be a concrete basement or the hold of a ship. What matters is not the object, but the choice. The choice to take something small and desperate, an animal, a man's own body, and make them enemies to each other. The Middle Ages are over, but the appetite that once filled the dungeons of Ghent, Antwerp, and Cartagena has not died. It waits in the corners of the present, clothed in new names, carried out in new rooms. And when it appears again, it will not announce itself as history. It will come quietly as it always has, in the sound of boots in a corridor, in the smell of heat against clay, in the faint scratching of something that wants out. The flame bends under its own weakness, a thin tongue of light fighting against the damp air. Wax pools at its base, running down in pale streams that cling for a moment before vanishing into the cracks between the stones. The cell is as it was in the beginning, narrow, airless, its walls glistening with the sweat of centuries. But now every corner, every stone carries a different weight. The smell of mold is no longer just mold. The scratching in the dark is no longer just an animal searching for food. Every detail has become an omen. The prisoner's breathing is slow, each inhale an effort. The wrists are bound again, though the flesh there is already rubbed raw. The belly rises and falls under the cold touch of iron rings. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps move in deliberate rhythm, unhurried, as though there is no need to rush what cannot be escaped. The pot is brought in with the same indifference one might carry a loaf of bread. Clay, soot darkened, its rim worn smooth from the hands that have gripped it before. Inside, the faint shuffle of life, a sound so small it could be mistaken for the settling of dust. The candle flickers once, twice. The door closes, leaving the room sealed in its own breathing. The heat from the brazier builds, slow, patient. Somewhere deep in the prisoner's mind, memories try to surface: a mother's face, a sunlit field, the smell of rain on warm earth. They dissolve before they form, swept away by the sharper, closer reality, the weight on the belly, the scrape of claws, the sudden frenzy within the pot when the heat begins to creep through the clay. No one speaks. There is no need. The room holds its own language, the sound of panic against stone, the tear of teeth through muscle, the muffled, desperate noise of a body trying to curl in on itself. The candle burns lower. The wax reaches the edge of the base, spilling across the stone like the lines of a map that leads only inward. The flame wavers, struggling for air, shrinking into itself until it is no more than a pin of gold. In the darkness that follows, there is still movement, the kind the eye cannot see but the body knows. It is in the walls, in the air, in the skin itself. And when at last it is over, nothing leaves the room but the rats. The man remains, in flesh or in memory, it does not matter. The cell will hold him either way. Above, life will go on. The market will open, the bells will ring for mass, the ships will leave the harbor. But somewhere beneath it all, in a place without light, the last candle will have burned away, and the darkness will have swallowed another name.